Bonsoir et merci d'être tous là encore un dimanche soir. Je suis ravie d'être la modératrice pour la discussion autour de ce film, qui est un film, comme le disait tout à l'heure Philippe, qui est vraiment important, vraiment nécessaire. Donc un grand merci Ege pour ce film et à vous bien sûr et à toute l'équipe. Je voudrais aussi remercier toute l'équipe du FIFDH. On arrive à la fin de 10 jours qui ont été 10 jours forts. Une très belle édition, une très belle 22e édition du FIFDH qui nous a fait passer par toutes les émotions. La colère, l'indignation, les pleurs, la joie aussi, les rires parfois, et surtout cette sensation que oui, beaucoup a été dit sur la situation du monde qui est le nôtre. Beaucoup a été dit sur les violations des droits humains qui sont très larges, y compris ce qu'on vient de voir à travers ce film. Et il s'agit aussi maintenant de réfléchir à la manière dont on va réagir, à la manière dont on va agir. C'est l'idée de cette dernière séance, c'est l'idée de cette dernière discussion, de se centrer sur l'idée que oui, on sait que la situation est complexe, que la situation est parfois dramatique, et on sait aussi qu'il existe des solutions. Je crois que le film qu'on vient de voir le montre en partie. Et on sait aussi que pour mettre en place ces solutions, il faut du courage, il faut de l'intégrité, il faut du collectif, il faut reconnaître notre interdépendance et il faut être capable d'agir, avoir les moyens d'agir. C'est ce dont nous allons parler dans la table ronde et je vais appeler nos 4 panélistes qui nous font l'honneur d'être là ce soir avec nous. Donc si vous voulez bien monter. Là, aussi, là. Comme vous voulez. On va faire ça en bilingue, donc il y a des moments où ça sera en français, d'autres moments où ça sera en anglais. It's a great honor to have the 4 of you tonight. Really, a big thank you for being with us. And I'm really looking very much forward to listening to you following this really powerful movie. So I will start with Professor Ghosh. Professor Ghosh is a development economist who is teaching both in the US at Amherst University, but also in India. She's a prolific author. You've advised governments, multilateral organizations on many different issues, always with an agenda of justice and equity. But today also you're a movie star and you're a member of the ECRIT Commission, as we understood very well. You're one of the 2 co-leaders of the Commission and you're also a protagonist of the film we just saw. Corinne Pelluchon, vous êtes professeur de philosophie et d'éthique appliquée à l'Université Gustave Eiffel en France. Vous développez une philosophie de la corporéité avec 2 dimensions, l'une centrée sur la vulnérabilité, on parlera de ça tout à l'heure, l'autre sur notre habitation de la Terre, et là aussi on va bien parler de notre habitation de la Terre. Vous avez reçu en 2020 le prix Gunther Anders de la pensée critique pour l'ensemble de vos travaux. Jeff Mann, you're a professor of political economy in the geography department of Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. You've worked on the politics and political economy of capitalism with a focus on the historical development and future trajectory of macroeconomic governance. You've also worked on the political economics and politics of climate change. You've long been associated with the British Columbia office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative. Welcome. And finally, last certainly not least, Bernard Harcourt, you're a critical theorist and a lawyer with a specialization in the area of punishment, surveillance, legal and political theory and political economy. You're a professor at Columbia University Law School and at EHESS in Paris. You're also doing pro bono legal work on human rights issues, so welcome also tonight. So I will start indeed with Professor Ghosh because I would like to start with the movie and I would like to start with the Commission and its work. And we hear all through the discussions, we hear this is a marathon, you know, this is a long run process with many, many steps. And what I would like to start with is really to understand from your perspectives, you know, where do you feel in terms of 15 years of work and the amount of steps that have been really achieved? You know, there are at least three elements. The first element is the level of the tax, the 15%, where you were obviously all, you know, targeting 20%, 25%. And to some degree, Joe Stiglitz says it's very fast, but I think that's also something that I've always been thinking about once, you know, the decision was taken to stay at 15%. How do we prevent minimum tax rate to become a maximum tax rate? That's really a first question. The second question is really connected to the last part of the movie. How do we actually put in place a unitary tax rate at the global level when we don't have a global state and when the UN is, you know, in a difficult situation? And the third, you know, step, obviously, that seems to be a very important one, is how do we move on to individuals, to very rich individuals? So how do you feel personally, Professor Ghosh, about those things?
Well, thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Marie-Laure, and thank you, Hege, for making this film. I mean, I really did not think you could make an interesting film about taxation, and you've done it, so thank you. You know, I think you're right. We haven't got a lot of what we wanted so far. And I'm saying so far for a reason. Because, you know, when we started out, we were seen as crazies. I mean, yes, we had some very prominent people like, you know, Joe Stiglitz and Piketty and so on. But most people thought we were crazy because the idea that you could, even the concept of a unitary taxation was seen as, oh, no, you can't do it. And how will you don't have a world state and all of that. And minimum taxation, that the countries will never agree, you know, as Gabrielle has mentioned in the film. But it has happened. The concept has been accepted even by the OECD, which is actually remarkable. Once you have got that foot in the door, or the thin end of the wedge, or whatever you like, you can actually push for more. So yes, 15 is far too low. There is genuinely a threat that it can become a maximum rather than a minimum, unless countries themselves say, no, we will not let that happen. So I think what we're really hoping for now, the way to get the multilateral process forward more is for coalitions of countries to work together, which means, for example, Group of Africa has been amazing. The whole reason that it's in the UN at all is because of the Group of Africa pushing it so much. Latin America now, they have the PTLAC, which is progressive, you know, it's a forum for progressive taxation in Latin America, where there are 8 countries, big countries that matter, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. Colombia started it, actually. And if they work together, if the Group of Africa works together, if other countries also say, no, we are going to carry on with our rates of 21% or 25%, and we will impose that minimum tax, then we can actually push the whole multilateral system forward. On the unitary taxation, you don't actually need a global state. All you need is for countries to say, I know that this is my share of their global profits because of my share of sales and employment. So let's say India has, I don't know, 5% share of the global profits of Amazon. So they will say, well, I can see Amazon's global profits because they reveal it to their shareholders. I am taxing my 5% share at the Indian tax rate of 21%. And you don't need a global state for that. The trouble is countries are afraid of doing it, as was said in the film, in fact, because they're afraid. You know, that multinationals will put pressure, they'll do this, they'll do that. Once you have a few countries, a few big, large countries, I mean, Amazon or Apple are not going to say we will not operate in Brazil and India and Colombia and Argentina and, well, not, whatever. Sadly, not Argentina right now, but other countries. Then you can actually get more movement multilaterally as well. So I'm actually quite hopeful about the progress of the UN negotiations. First of all, I'm delighted that it moved to the UN. Again, it was not possible. It was being blocked all the time by the OECD countries. They accepted it. So in a way, the kind of momentum has moved in our favor, or in the world's population's favor. Just one final point I want to make. It's not about countries versus other countries. It's really about multinationals and very, very rich people versus everybody else. So the citizens of Europe, the citizens of the US are also very badly affected by this loss of tax revenue, which, the gaming of the system by rich corporations and rich people. So doing something would actually benefit everybody in the planet.
Thank you very much. And a second question for you is really on the dynamics of collective organization, on ICRIC itself, and how do you build such a coalition? It's at some point in the movie, we are told that it took 2 years. So how come it's so difficult? And the second question connected to that is, how do you connect it to other groups? We also saw that there's a kind of an archipelago, in fact, of organizations working on this issue. So how do you work with those other organizations?
So ICRIC was actually created, as you saw, in that basement and so on, by what is now today called the steering group. So it is a whole group of all the international NGOs, etc., who are concerned with tax justice for different reasons. So it could be a global health NGO that recognizes you don't have the money for it. So they're all connected, and they have set it up. So there's a steering group that created, and we are just a bunch of, lawyers and economists and people and former ministers and so on, who were brought together for that purpose. So in a way, we work together because we're all committed to that cause. And we have some very high-profile members, as you saw there. And they are able to get that message. When Professor Stiglitz says something, more people listen, right? And if it is just some NGO saying it, they'll say, it's just that NGO, ignore them. So it has that impact. I think what they did, it was a very smart idea. I would actually recommend this to anybody working in any global issue where you're not getting enough traction. Find some globally known people to represent those ideas. No, seriously, it clearly makes a difference. It actually generates more awareness, knowledge, or at least even the OECD says, maybe we should consider that argument a little bit. Which they would not have if it had just been Tax Justice Network. So I think that was a very clever strategy, and I think it's a strategy that can be replicated in other issues as well, in all economic and social justice issues, actually. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Professor Mann now. And actually, another question that came to my mind while watching the movie, the film for the second time, and I didn't really think so much about it the first time, and I want to put that to you, Jeff, is really, well, let's say this is, the beginning of a big marathon, and let's hope we get to 25% at some point. 25% would be indeed, I think, a good step. And let's think that we manage that at some point, and that we manage to actually tax multinational firms by 25%. The big question to me at this stage is, how do we make sure that those tax revenues are getting where they should be getting, which is in all the issues that are being, discussed in the film, but have been discussed throughout the last 10 days here in Geneva, and not, for example, into building military power, which seems to be the fashion those days. So how do we do this? How do we, that's the other, it seems to me, the other side of the coin, which is not really, we haven't yet discussed.
Yeah, that's a very important question. Perhaps the most important question, I would suggest, just because it is true that at a moment when I think it's fair to say I have a very North American, I have a level of familiarity mostly with the North American context, so I don't want to speak for the whole world by any means, but it does seem to me that there's a level of collective suspicion about our institutional framework right now that is pretty widespread. It's my first reaction to the film, aside from thinking it's a fantastic film, is to worry precisely about what are these people going to do with these revenues. I mean, the idea that Donald Trump would have more tax money to play with doesn't make me feel a whole lot better. And it probably doesn't make you feel a whole lot better either. And so then the question is, exactly, how do we make this money worthwhile and not become what it's been for so long? I obviously don't think there's any straightforward answer to that question. The obvious one is the mobilizations, like many of the characters in the film we're talking about, holding the state's feet to the fire, I should say. But I think even more importantly than that, we have to rethink some of the main mechanisms through which the state does its work. Right now, I think it's fair to say, hopefully most people would agree, that the state has become very market friendly and in fact uses the market as a governing mechanism so it can dispose of responsibility for itself quite frequently. I think we need to really press at the same time as we're doing this kind of work, which is obviously interventions in the market. We need to do more and more further pressing for interventions in the market that make the most important questions upon which we need governance decisions made not being decided both by big market players through subsidies or incentives that allow them to make the decisions as to what gets done in the realm of climate or the realm of healthcare. And we need to press very much for the market to not be the standard by which we judge the performance of the questions that matter so much to our lives. We're at a moment, my own level of expertise, of course, is mostly around climate. We're at a moment where it's a tough time. We cannot put ourselves in a situation where the answers have to be profitable. That cannot be the condition by which we respond to these questions. And so my first thought of this very important question is that we have to make the market not the measure of what we can achieve, because it's not the measure of what we can achieve. And it's, in my view, quite a disaster if we let it come to that.
Can I push you a bit on that? Because this is obviously something you've been working a lot on. And, you know, also beyond the tax issue, and that this film is helping us to understand and unpack more, there is really the question of the form of capitalism that is actually, you know, structuring our economy, but also our societies, our polities today. Can we call it maybe an extractive capitalism? So clearly, beyond simply it's not very simple, but beyond dealing with the tax, how do we actually approach this question of reforming capitalism in a way that actually makes it less extractive, less destructive, and more, in a sense, co-constructive of, you know, common value that we all need?
So that's a really big question.
Yeah, in 2 minutes. Huh?
I'll just pull the answer out of my back pocket. Again, I don't have, obviously, any better answer than anyone else in the room. I do think that there is a question, well, there's two questions that sort of underlie the issues that you're raising. The one is a kinder, gentler capitalism our goal? Should it be our goal? Personally, I don't think it should be. I'm an anti-capitalist. But I also am not naive nor utopian. And so it does often seem, and I think that many of the actors in the film, I would guess if I could sit down for a coffee with them, they would say the same thing. They would say that they would love to see something much more substantial and structural that happens here. But at present, our goals need perhaps to be more realistic, as they say, or pragmatic. And this kind of work, obviously, can make a huge difference, exactly what the folks in the film are doing. But at the same time, I am wary of the expectation that a capitalism that is only mildly less market-centered than the one that we have now is enough of an answer, especially for confronting problems like climate change, which I think the mix of climate and capitalism is why we have the problem of climate change. And it's very difficult for me, and I've spent the last 15 years thinking about this, it's very difficult for me to imagine market-oriented solutions to the kinds of problems we have, which means that we have to remove capitalism or remove markets from significant parts of the way that we run our lives. It's a massive transformation that's necessary. I know I'm stating the obvious. The reason that people are in this room is because they care. But I do think that we maybe need to set our sights farther than just a capitalism that is less extractive. Not that you're suggesting that's the only place. But I would really encourage, I know it's a long march, it's a marathon. We're going to have to be slow, but we also have to be really fast on some fronts. And I think that we need to combine ambition and boldness with some modesty about what's achievable at the time. and constantly cultivate any kinds of ideas and movements that might have a chance to help. We never know when the small struggles might matter.
Can I actually push on this for the two of you, Professor Ghosh and Professor Mann, with another question which is connected? I mean, if we think about this notion of unitary taxation, and if we think about climate change, let's focus on climate change, which we know is really a global issue that concerns all of us. Isn't there maybe a way to think about a model where tax doesn't go back, part of the tax at least doesn't go back to countries, but goes towards climate change? I mean, could there be a mechanisms like that? I mean, is that at all thinkable, or is it totally utopian? I don't know which one.
You know, there is this idea. I mean, so there's no shortage of the good ideas about how to fix the world, okay, or the planet. There is an idea about global public investment. So we have all these huge problems which are global and planetary and don't respect passports and visas and so on. So we have to deal with them globally. And global public investment is seen as the solution, where you raise, every country contributes, and then the money goes to where it is most needed, for obvious reasons, because that benefits everybody. I think the problem is what Jeff said. We know the current geopolitics is not going to work in that way. So just in terms of what you said, you know, Jeff, I want to just, I completely agree with you. But I think, you know, when we make these arguments, part of the problem is we say, oh, you know, we have to finish off capitalism in that, you know, people who are listening to you know it's not going to happen in their lifetime. So they say, well, okay, but tell us something we can do now, you know? And I think one of the things maybe we all need to do in terms of reorienting our minds is to ask, okay, what's an economy for? Forget whether it's market or state or whoever's doing it. It could be a terrible state-led economy, depending on who's running the state, yeah? In Russia, for example, or something. Let's think of, you know, what is an economy for? Unfortunately, all the time we are told that we have to do things for the economy. Health is good because it will give you more GDP. You know, something is good, adding, you know, putting more women into employment is good because it adds so much to GDP. All the time, everything we're told is for the economy. Or you're told you can't have this because it's not possible for the economy. No, we have to think, what is the society we want? We want a healthy society, egalitarian justice. We want a sustainable society that does not destroy the planet, does not deplete people like capitalism does, through unpaid care and so on. What is the economy that will generate that? And I think if we reverse it and put it that way, we can get more people thinking about the links between all of these. So yes, it's absolutely not just taxation, but what is the obligation of the state to provide in terms of the minimum social and economic rights of people, in terms of the, you know, reducing the unpaid care work that is done by women dominantly and by others, by et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in a sense, what I would say, need to do is persuade more and more people not to fall for that complete lie that everything we do is in service of this god of the economy, which is completely misplaced in terms of GDP growth, etc. Rather, we have to figure out a set of institutional arrangements and economic relationships that serve what we want as a society. Yeah.
Jeff, do you want to add something on that?
Just quick. Well, just quickly, aside from saying that it's a very helpful way to reframe the problem, one that I need to take more seriously when I'm having the bad days. But I would also, I just wanted to add too that I do think that part of the intransigence or the inertia that is caught up in so many of our institutions make it, I think, difficult for a lot of people, maybe I'm speaking for some of you, to believe that turning to the state right now is a possibility that might lead to something significantly different in even the medium term. And I just wanted to suggest that maybe some of the same work that Jayati's describing, we can do on the ground and force the state to respond. So this is about what I would say is building solidarities that I think that can be often motivated, if solely, by nothing else than the uncertainty that so many of us feel in this moment. there's a possibility to, I think, to open up conversations about our collective concern for our inability, many of us, to even imagine what the world will be like in 15 years. That's an opportunity to start to talk, I think, across lines that don't get crossed very often. And it might even allow us to build solidarities where we don't expect them, where when you do see them happen, they're incredibly fruitful. Like I've recently been involved in some work in British Columbia. I wasn't central to it at all, so I shouldn't take credit for it, where a group of older women who'd been fighting for provincially funded childcare connected with the climate activists in the province. And they built a movement that actually centered both things that most of the time are kept separate. And they made a promise to each other that they would never give up on either cause. And they built a solidarity there across, for one thing, generations, because much of the climate movement is young, but also around things that both matter. They really both matter. And that's an opportunity to, I think, create a politics that then the state has to respond to. And they did. We got $10 a day childcare. We haven't got climate change yet.
Thank you very much. This is actually a perfect transition to the questions that I want to ask to you, Professor Harcourt. You know, the movie, the film at some point tells us, some of the protagonists tell us, ideas count, ideas matter. And we have to start with ideas. But then we also very clearly see that it's, you know, ideas have to be brought into a collective mobilization and some collective form of action. And so the first question I would like to ask you is really, how do we move from critical theory, because the ideas are critical ideas, how do we move from critical theory to change?
Yeah, of course, that's the most important question, right? And there's a great line in Hege's great movie where the narrator says, ideas are weapons, right? And there's also a great line where Eva Joly, a hero for many years, says, you know, we need to transform ideas into action. And those are the pivots, right? Those are the places where it becomes so important to try and figure out from a critical perspective how to take these ideas. And of course, this is something that we've been concerned about for centuries in a way. I mean, it takes us back to, you know, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, Marx's famous line, you know, philosophy has only interpreted the world. At this point, we need to change it. Right? It's how to do that. Now, particularly difficult in a time like today where, as you can see here, our interdependence, our human interdependence, and, you know, as Jeff said, and Professor Ghosh as well, our interdependence is so great that most of the ideas actually from the 19th, from the 18th, are no longer kind of competent for this time of extraordinary human interdependence because they were so built on notions of individualism that were so important, at the time, and autonomy, and individual autonomy, right? Which was, you know, these Kantian imperatives of governing oneself that really don't fit so well in a world where we are completely interdependent, like we have never been before, where our actions right here affect the lives of billions of people on the other side of the planet. So we really have to figure out how. And I think this movie and the work you've been doing shows that it has to do with cooperation somehow. It has to do with a notion of cooperation that serves as an alternative to competition to the bottom. And that's what we have. We have these forms of competition to the bottom that are utterly destructive. Extractive is one way to put it, but utterly destructive and destroying the planet. But there are right hidden in plain sight forms of cooperation that have existed for such a long time. Of course, it's the cooperation that you're talking about and trying to create here, but it's also the cooperation that we have in our own lives and that we can find in so many places, whether it's, you know, worker cooperatives or consumer cooperatives or food cooperatives or mutuals or credit unions, right, that exist all around us and that can serve as an alternative to the forms of competition that are destroying the world. So we need to, I think what we need to do, and you know, in some places it's easier than others because, I mean, in my death penalty practice, I don't have any choice but to file habeas cases, to act, because it's really, we're up against the wall. It's much more difficult in the economic realm, because we need to be more affirmative in the way that we move towards cooperation or other solutions or praxis, right? But I think it is in looking around us and seeing hidden, kind of in plain sight, all these alternative forms to the logic, in a way, to the logic of capital investment and return on investment, that is what is kind of giving birth to these imperatives of tax evasion and making tax evasion logical for these managers, right? Because they're guided, they're controlled by, they're determined by kind of the question of the return on investment for their companies. And they're just trying to bring that down. Whereas, you know, we could look at other models, worker cooperatives, that have other principles than the return on investment, but principles of sustainability of the environment, equality, equal say in the workplace, et cetera, that could possibly displace the forms of extractive capitalism that exist today.
So if I can push you a bit on this part where you tell us, okay, you know, we have to mobilize our own self towards praxis. So, you know, what more can I do? How do you answer that question to yourself first? And what kind of advice do you give all of us here in this room? Because you mentioned the fact that when you're defending a death row person, it's a different form of urgency.
Right.
So how do we create this same kind of urgency for ourselves individually?
Yeah. That's the exact question we need to be asking. What more can I do? I think that's the exact question, because I mean it's quite difficult to be telling other people what they should do, or at least it's offensive, or it doesn't go over very well. And so that's the question that we need to ask ourselves, and then we need to look at everything we are doing in our lives and how we live our lives. And what are the kind of ambitions that we give ourselves, right? It has everything to do with thinking about working with other people and finding mechanisms that will avoid these outcomes, that will avoid global climate change, at least that will avoid an increasing warmth, even though it's impossible to bring that warmth down, but just to avoid the continuity of this problem. And to do that, I think it's a question of looking around and seeing some existing alternative models, right? Maybe pending some kind of revolution. I mean, in the present, in the immediate, right? You know, the Black Panthers had all of these extraordinary community service programs, free breakfast for children, free food, free health care. It was really remarkable that what they were trying to put in place, because because the government wasn't providing this for them. And they put in place all of these remarkable community service programs, and they called it survival programs pending revolution. But I think that's what we need to be thinking. We need to be thinking about what can we do in the immediate, right? Pending some transformation that's on the horizon, maybe, but that people don't necessarily feel is going to come right now. And there are. I mean, in other words, you know, the relationship between ideas and praxis is really important here. We talk a lot about capitalism. The word capitalism itself is misleading, because it gives you this idea that it's capital that's doing everything, that there are laws of capital. One of the marvelous things about this book is it really shows that there aren't laws of capital. What there are states governing, right, in a kind of very dirigiste way, right, setting tax rates that went up during the middle of the 20th, as Piketty has demonstrated, that come crashing down after Reagan, right? These are all choices. These are all choices that are being made. And so we need to try and look around and see what the logics are there, and then change them in our own lives, so that we ourselves if we are, say, we don't need to work for one of those corporations, right? We could think of starting our own worker cooperative, for instance, or buying through consumer cooperatives, right? In everything we do, housing cooperatives, mutuals, insurance, there's plenty of them. Actually, the mutual insurance business is really important, and it's not motivated by the kind of return on investments that exist here. Or credit unions. In the US, the Federal Navy Credit Union is one of the biggest cooperatives in the country. So in everything that we do, actually, where we bank, where we insure, where we work, where we buy our food, our consumption, where we work, right? We can be trying to change the world ourselves. And that doesn't require all of the governments getting together. It's something that comes from the bottom, in a way, and it comes from all of us, right? Pending some more revolutionary change.
So putting the pressure on the margins, in a sense, and building up.
Well, I'd like to think we're more than the margins, right? I'd like to think that we're actually, we're it. We're the ones who consume. We're the ones who buy. We're the ones who, right, who insure ourselves. We're the ones who deposit our money. I mean, so it all comes from us. And so we need to be much more mindful of every dimension of how we live, to start with. And what's remarkable about that is that it doesn't require a vote at any assembly, right? That's what's so remarkable.
It's just my vote.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just our action and just our cooperation, right?
Thank you very much. Professeur Pelluchon, je vais me tourner vers vous pour continuer en fait dans la même direction d'une certaine façon, c'est-à-dire recentrer sur comment on agit, pourquoi on agit, chacun d'entre nous, chacune d'entre nous. Dans votre dernier livre, au titre fort, L'espérance ou la traversée de l'impossible, vous nous proposez de faire le pari de l'espérance. Alors, en français, on a deux mots, on a l'espoir et l'espérance. En anglais, on a un seul mot, hope. Et donc, j'aimerais bien que vous commenciez par nous expliquer finalement la différence entre espérance et espoir, en tout cas telle que vous la définissez dans le livre.
Oui, merci. Et d'abord, merci à la cinéaste, parce que c'était vraiment un film magnifique qu'il faut recommander à chacun. Et le fait de le voir une deuxième fois, c'est encore mieux, je trouve. Alors, effectivement, il y a deux mots. L'espoir, c'est l'attente de voir ses vœux personnels se réaliser, alors que c'est souvent une illusion, en tout cas une projection, alors que l'espérance est une vertu théologale à côté de la charité et de la foi. Et surtout, pour moi, c'est quelque chose qui n'est pas personnel. C'est une attente, mais de quelque chose qui n'est pas forcément déterminé, précis, qui n'est pas une projection. Au contraire, ce sera même inattendu. On en reparlera par rapport aux débats qui ont eu lieu ce soir. Et c'est l'espérance, donc, c'est pour moi, je la définirais ainsi, la capacité à voir, en dépit de la gravité de la situation et du chaos, la capacité à voir en dépit du chaos les signes avant-coureurs de quelque chose qui pourrait ouvrir de nouveau l'avenir. Ce qui veut dire que l'espérance se distingue non seulement de l'attente personnelle, mais également, c'est son deuxième caractère, elle suppose la traversée de l'impossible, la connaissance si aiguë de la difficulté qu'on en perd tous ses repères, qu'on en perd l'illusion d'avoir des réponses aux problèmes que nous avons. Autrement dit, pour qu'elles naissent, et peut-être aujourd'hui, paradoxalement, la situation gravissime dans laquelle nous sommes, au niveau climatique, mais aussi socio-économique et politique et géopolitique, cette situation est paradoxalement la possibilité de reparler d'espérance, c'est-à-dire d'une manière de configurer l'avenir, qu'on ne voit plus, mais d'une manière de le configurer, justement, quand on regarde en face et qu'on traverse toutes les émotions négatives liées à la prise de conscience de la précarité de notre civilisation, pas seulement de la possibilité de notre impossibilité, de notre menace à notre vie, mais surtout qu'on comprenne que le modèle de développement, j'aime mieux ça plutôt que de parler de capitalisme, que le modèle de développement qui est le nôtre et qui associe les structures sociales et le psychisme, la subjectivité, se caractérise par la domination dont les pères de la théorie critique, Adorno, Horkheimer, en tout cas dans le livre Dialectique de la raison, Dialectique des Lumières, disaient que cette domination est triple, à la fois des autres humains, domination sociale, elle est aussi domination de la nature à l'extérieur de nous, les écosystèmes, la nature, l'extractivisme, et elle est domination de notre propre nature, répression de notre vulnérabilité, de notre propre nature, de ce que nous avons en commun avec les autres vivants. Et là, j'en viens finalement au cœur de la réponse, et peut-être aussi de la non-réponse, mais de la, oui, du lien entre ce qui a été dit auparavant et ce que je vais dire. C'est-à-dire qu'en tout cas, selon moi, le cœur du problème et la solution peut-être aussi réside dans non seulement la manière dont on prend conscience de ce qu'on achète, de la manière dont on mange et de l'impact qu'on a sur les humains et les animaux quand on mange et qu'on distribue les ressources, mais c'est aussi vraiment toute cette manière de... j'ai perdu ce que je voulais dire. Dès que je parle des animaux, je perds toujours mes opinions parce que c'est tellement important. Mais c'est structure sociale, la structure sociale et la subjectivité, c'est-à-dire la manière dont on accepte sa vulnérabilité, sa corporéité et aussi sa finitude. Et je crois vraiment que l'écologie, qui est plus que la lutte contre le réchauffement climatique et l'érosion de la biodiversité, qui est une question de justice sociale, de partage des nourritures, des ressources, en tout cas des milieux, des écosystèmes, mais c'est aussi une manière de vivre et d'être. C'est une manière de penser, de se rapporter aux autres vivants, et la clé du rapport à la nature et aux autres humains et autres qu'humains, c'est, je crois, la réconciliation avec sa finitude, sa vulnérabilité. Oui, humains, nous sommes liberté, nous avons une responsabilité très grande, et qui excède d'ailleurs ce que notre temps présent, mais nous avons aussi cette corporéité, et quand on prend au sérieux cette corporéité, le fait que nous mangeons, que nous avons besoin d'air, qu'avant d'être libres, il y a cette matérialité de notre existence, et que nous sommes toujours dépendants et en rapport avec les autres humains, et nous sommes dépendants de la nature et des écosystèmes. Dès que nous respirons, que nous mangeons, que nous occupons à l'espace, eh bien, ça souligne le fait que l'éthique n'est pas une discipline abstraite, mais c'est la place qu'on accorde aux autres au sein de son existence, dès qu'on mange, dès qu'on habite quelque part, dès qu'on... voilà. Et du coup, c'est l'autolimitation. Et ça, je crois que la révolution anthropologique ou philosophique qui est derrière tous les débats et qui inclut effectivement le seuil, enfin les limites qu'on assigne aux entreprises qui font de tels profits, c'est vraiment cette reconnaissance de l'appartenance à un monde commun, et c'est cette reconnaissance de notre finitude. Et ça, je crois que d'une certaine manière, c'est ça la bonne nouvelle des crises terribles. Et pour revenir, et je finirai là, sur l'espérance, c'est que vraiment, l'espérance, personne ne peut la décréter. Ce n'est pas une idéologie qui fixerait ou solidifierait le possible. On ne sait pas tout à fait tout, mais on devine, ou en tout cas on sent, on peut l'annoncer, comme dans la Bible, eh bien, on a des signes avant-coureurs de quelque chose qui pourrait créer une nouvelle ère. On pourrait nommer une autre époque. Moi, je la nomme le vivant, l'ère du vivant. Et je crois vraiment que le féminisme, l'écologie, prise dans sa dimension existentielle et profonde, comme autre manière d'habiter la Terre et de cohabiter avec les autres. Le désir de convivialité, de coopération, le fait de renouer avec un projet de progrès social, tout ça, et la question animale, qui est finalement la bombe, puisqu'avec ça, vraiment, l'exploitation animale fait sauter absolument tous les verrous de nos représentations et des structures sociales, du profit, etc. Eh bien, on voit ces sujets différents, mais qui tous convergent vers le désir profond d'habiter autrement et d'avoir un rapport à la nature, aux autres et peut-être aussi à soi-même qui ne soit pas de domination. Et c'est ça qui pourrait ne pas être seulement un concept philosophique joli, mais une structuration, ce que j'appelle un schème de la considération, quelque chose qui pourrait être l'axe à partir duquel nous faisons un inventaire pour voir ce que nous gagnons, ce que nous gardons du passé, l'autonomie, mais reconfigurée, les droits de l'homme, peut-être un petit peu déplacés pour l'humanité, le vivant, la question de la démocratie, qui ne va pas de soi, fonder un projet sur l'égalité, c'est toujours à recommencer, et l'unité de l'humanité, qui est effectivement derrière le projet des droits de l'homme, et la rationalité, qui n'est pas seulement un instrument de pouvoir, et qui ne l'est pas du tout d'ailleurs, et qui est aussi, non pas une arme, mais en tout cas un outil pour saisir ce qui est universalisable. Et avec ça, ce qui est quand même des piliers des Lumières, et à la lumière de notre vulnérabilité, on peut tout à fait redessiner un projet de société. Et moi, ce qui m'étonne, ce qui me déprime, parce qu'on peut avoir de l'espérance et néanmoins être un peu fatigué, anxieux, et justement, comme je disais, l'espérance suppose qu'on ait pris au sérieux tout ce qui s'effondre, pour justement faire de la place et remarquer, être capable de remarquer ce que d'habitude on ne voit pas, toutes ces créations, innovations, ça et là, qui, dans l'agriculture, dans l'élevage, dans l'éducation, dans la santé, ouvrent du possible et sont des alternatives. Mais, moi, ce qui m'inquiète, c'est qu'on a tous les outils intellectuels pour tout faire, et ça ne se fait pas. Et là, j'ai bien retenu l'idée d'organisation, de groupe, en choisissant quelqu'un de bons ambassadeurs qui puissent faire pression. La grande question, c'est ça. Comment faire pression sans que cette pression soit une colère qui mette à bas la démocratie, ses institutions, mais en étant plus utile que nous, parce qu'heureusement que Stieglitz a dit que lui, il avait beaucoup travaillé avec parfois peu de résultats, parce que si lui, il dit, alors nous. Mais voilà, donc c'est ça la question, je la refile la patate chaude, parce que cette question de comment on transforme pas seulement les idées en action, parce qu'on aurait tout pour faire un projet politique sur l'écologie, au sens fort du terme, mais comment on y arrive, comment on a des gens qui suivent ça et qui reprennent ça sans tout utiliser, tout pervertir finalement.
Donc, parfait. On arrive en fait au moment où on va devoir ouvrir la salle, mais je voudrais juste peut-être réagir à ça qui me semble aller exactement dans la direction dans laquelle on doit aller. Et finalement, en fait, ce que vous nous dites, c'est que la fécondité, cette vulnérabilité, c'est une sorte de paradigme nouveau, différent, pas nouveau, mais différent, particulièrement par rapport au paradigme du transhumanisme qui dit le contraire, qui dit que la vulnérabilité est notre point faible et qu'il faut absolument la combler, il faut absolument la détruire et donc d'une certaine façon détruire notre humanité. Donc on a finalement la proposition ici d'une arme intellectuelle, d'une idée qui peut finalement être un contrepoids par rapport à ce modèle dominant qui va très bien avec le mode de développement dont on a parlé tout à l'heure.
Oui, je vais aller assez vite. Oui, mais la vulnérabilité, c'est aussi une force, c'est la capacité, à être blessé, à pas se défendre tout seul, mais c'est aussi la capacité à être atteint pour l'autre. Lévinas fait de la responsabilité une passivité. Donc, mais ce que je veux dire, moi, je crois qu'on avait tout aussi. C'est-à-dire, moi, ce que j'appelle considération, ça a toujours existé. Ce qu'il faut se demander, c'est pourquoi on a emprunté le chemin de ce modèle de développement qui, en particulier après la Seconde Guerre mondiale, a vu l'intensification de l'élevage intensif, l'agriculture de manière très violente, finalement. Je reprends un peu l'imaginaire des écoféministes, mais c'est tellement juste. Pourquoi on a pris ce chemin et dont aujourd'hui on sait qu'il nous envoie dans le mur. Et il y a d'autres sociétés qui ont emprunté un chemin un peu différent dans le rapport aux autres vivants, à la nature. Donc là, en tout cas, il y a l'idée d'un inventaire à faire, sans jeter par-dessus bord la philosophie des droits de l'homme, des Lumières, la rationalité, pour repenser notre rapport au monde et à nous, et qui passe par un rapport à soi. Et j'ajouterais, moi, je crois vraiment que ce qui est intéressant avec la corporité, c'est que c'est pas seulement justement le corps. C'est que en prenant conscience du fait que quand on mange, on est toujours en contact avec les autres, que quand on est né, disait Hannah Arendt, on est accueilli par un monde plus vieux que soi et plus grand que soi, qui est fait du patrimoine culturel, dit-elle, j'ajouterais naturel, et des institutions et des générations passées, puisque on est toujours plus vieille que soi-même, il y a le trouble de plusieurs existences derrière soi, et puis nous sommes les parents des générations futures, parce qu'avec la bombe atomique et nos modèles de développement, on a un impact sur eux. Eh bien, le monde commun et l'ensemble des générations, le patrimoine naturel et culturel, et ce monde commun plus vieux, plus vaste que soi, qui nous accueille à notre naissance, donne une épaisseur à notre vie individuelle. Elle dit que c'est une transcendance dans l'immanence. Moi, j'ajouterais que justement, en approfondissant la connaissance de soi, de façon très quotidienne, c'est à la portée de chacun, on a un rapport à ce qui me dépasse, à cet incommensurable, à ce monde commun plus vieux, plus vaste que soi, et que nous pouvons préserver. Et on se rappelle que pour elle, le nouveau-né est l'emblème, le schème du pluralisme politique, puisque chaque enfant qui naît est une surprise, est imprévisible et a la possibilité et la promesse de créer quelque chose de différent qui mérite de durer quand il a eu l'éducation lui permettant de s'inscrire dans ce monde. Eh bien, le nouveau-né est aussi l'emblème de l'espérance. Mais je dirais, enfin en tout cas, du monde qu'on pourrait faire, quelque chose d'imprévisible, mais et en même temps auquel on peut donner sa chance. Et je finirais par dire que Charles Péguy, qui est mort assez jeune, dans un poème sur l'espérance, en vertu théologale, il a comparé à une petite fille que personne ne voit, à laquelle personne ne fait attention. Hein, elle n'est pas spectaculaire, elle n'est pas héroïque, elle n'arrive pas comme un soldat. Personne peut créer l'espérance, hein, ou alors il faut vraiment s'inquiéter. Hein, les donneurs d'espérance, on peut l'interdire, on peut la bloquer, mais elle vient quand elle vient. C'est comme l'amour, c'est une surprise, c'est l'inespéré. Hein. Eh bien, mais il la compare à une petite fille qui n'a l'air de rien et qui néanmoins traîne ses deux grandes sœurs, les deux autres vertus théologales, la charité qu'il compare à une mère et la foi qu'il compare à une épouse loyale. Et c'est très beau, ça, cette idée que l'espérance, d'une certaine manière, quand on n'a plus d'espérance, individuellement et collectivement, c'est destructeur. Parce que c'est là que se logent les récits simplificateurs qui font à croire avec des personnes qui exploitent le malaise social, qui font à croire qu'il y a des coupables, qu'on va dénoncer des coupables et qu'on trouvera des solutions rapides. Et donc, c'est vraiment l'idée d'être capable de reconfigurer l'avenir, non pas avec des idéologies, quelles qu'elles soient, non, évidemment pas en suivant les récits simplificateurs de l'extrême droite, hein, mais en s'attachant de manière très fine à ce qu'on voit pour lire les signes avant-coureurs de quelque chose qui pourrait nous amener loin, même si dans l'immédiat, je suis assez pessimiste. Et je finirai par dire que l'espérance, c'est le contraire de l'optimisme, qui est une posture, hein, tout va très bien, Madame la Marquise, on peut tout changer. Ça suppose vraiment cette traversée d'une nuit qui est là, et en même temps, au moment où on perd tout, eh bien, perdons aussi la toute-puissance, l'arrogance, pour justement voir qu'il reste ce lien fondamental au vivant qui rend justement la vie et l'appartenance à un monde commun si prégnant que le désir naît de vous faire tout son possible, même modestement, pour le préserver.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, on a des questions dans la salle. Il y en a une et deux là, voilà. Donc je ne sais pas où sont les micros, ils devraient ici, voilà. Est-ce que vous pouvez vous lever puis vous présenter rapidement?
Thank you so much for your invaluable comments. There's one comment I would like to challenge, and that's the idea of a revolution as a way to go forward. When we think about revolution, it implies radical ideas. It implies a crisis, and we cannot afford a crisis. Rather, I like the idea of revisionism. I like the idea that we have to be very patient and we have to take our actions based on evidence-based, careful research. we have to know why do we take decisions and how do we take our decisions, taking into account our biases and limitations. And when it comes to social justice, we have a lot of limitations. Because social justice, as you have demonstrated, is not conforming to our legal norms. And I think the way we could start, at least starting to change our thinking about it, is going back to where this thought process has emerged. In the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, when the United States and the current G7 have been designing the idea of how the world works. And this is important because nowadays we have professionalized social sciences that the mission of which is to think about these issues. But back then,
Can you go to the question?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
So very briefly, what I want to say is that we had politicians designing the system that were not social scientists, that were businessmen and that were lawyers. And nowadays we have the tools to ask these questions, but maybe we are starting from the wrong place. Social science is never neutral. It reflects the idea, the interests of the party who funds it, who designs it. There's always a personal element. Science is not biased. Science is something that we do know, and climate change science has shown that. How can we depolitize universities? How can we depolitize the social sciences? And how can we make science to be the guide to our social justice and law? Thank you.
That's a big question. So I propose we take another one. And just behind, yes. And you hold on to this one too, yeah.
Yes, I'd like to ask the opinion of one of the members of the panel in relation to what should we do to taking action, to doing something about the situation. I believe that by shifting, we are receiving this message that we need to shift. The responsibility falls on individuals, on small groups, on local groups, on cooperatives, and all these things. And I think that's, not fair for us people, for individuals, and is actually not realistic. It's not going to happen. So I believe we still have something very old and ancient that we need to reinforce, which is politics. Only through politics we're going to change. I don't believe through individual action, through group action. It's only 1 or 2% of us who really care about things. We are not going to change things in our local neighborhood, in our local cooperative. So shouldn't we actually get more involved in politics? Shouldn't we participate all more in politics? Even if we don't like it, if we don't trust it, let's change it. But let's not just throw it away, because politics is what is there for something. It's to help us solve our problems as society. I think that's what we need, more politics. And let's give, if we all vote for the Green Party, maybe we wouldn't have some of these problems.
Thank you. Do we have another last question? Yeah, I don't see on all the way in the back. Yeah, and then once we have this third question, then I'll give you all a round of answers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the film and for the panel. My name is Alana Openshore. I just detect a tension here between what is being said amongst panel members. So the Commission is working, of course, to have companies pay the tax they owe. That is absolutely right. But of course, those are the companies that are extracting all the resources of our planet. I'm understanding the Commission essentially understands those taxes pay our public services. It's essentially a project that speaks to the need for that kind of consumption to continue to pay for those public services that we all rely on. And yet here on the other side of the panel, we're talking about the need to transform capitalism. Where does the money come from for those public services that we so seek and rely on if we're changing the system that we're operating on that is actually what the Commission is relying on to extract taxes from to support the public services? So just pointing out sort of that question about.
So you don't have to answer all the questions, but you can pick and choose. So maybe we start with you, Jeff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to finish with Professor Gosh.
Yes, I would be happy to just listen to Jayati from now on. Perhaps I'll leave the last question to Jayati, since she knows much more about the work of the Commission, and just try to briefly address the other two interventions. To the second gentleman, I totally agree. There's nothing that's going to happen if we don't go through politics. That politics can be quite radical, I think, more radical than it is. It sounds like you probably agree. But there's nothing, just like the brief success story I told, I don't have very many to tell, but about childcare in British Columbia, like that was all just endless mobilization. And the kind of work that you're describing, much of it was super boring for the people involved. But it mattered. So I totally agree, and I actually think that no matter how radical our proposals are up here, including those of Bernard, or Corinne, these are fairly, substantial changes in the subjectivity with which we experience modern society. Those are going to take a lot of work, and it's going to be political work. There's no doubt about it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I want to affirm the comment. And just to respond briefly, I actually think that as a person who's quite closely involved with a lot of climate science, it's very political, actually. The science is political. I can see what you're saying, that some of the results are arguably objective knowledge. But as a person who's actually spent the last year digging through climate models, there's a lot in there that's not very objective. And one of the first things that climate scientists will admit is that they actually have extraordinary uncertainty. The scary part is that the uncertainty is all on the bad end, if that makes any sense. So for example, one of the fundamental key variables in every single global climate model is so-called climate sensitivity, which is the increase in the temperature by doubling CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. It's a central variable in every model. We have a best guess that it's about 3.5, but we also think it could be 8. We're not far from doubling at this moment, as you may know. So the uncertainties there are between very, very big deal and total catastrophe. That's the difference. The gap between that in science gets filled with politics, the same as it does in social science. And I actually think that's good. I think that this is, for me at least, this is where the commitment of knowledge really makes its play. And I agree with you in some ways that the universities have become in some ways sort of laboratories of polarization that model society and aren't very functional, but I actually think that they could be the place where people talk who don't normally talk, which would be very exciting. So that's my brief response, but thanks very much.
Thank you. Professeur Pelluchon, je vous donne la parole.
Oui, je suis d'accord avec mon voisin. La subjectivité ne suffit pas, ou les changements individuels. Il y a toujours cette articulation fondamentale entre les changements individuels, la subjectivité, les structures sociales, la réorientation de l'économie. Je parle en français, je peux parler en anglais, d'accord. Donc, du coup, on aurait tort de ne prendre qu'un côté des choses. Parce qu'il ne faut pas oublier non plus que quand il n'y a pas de pression sociale, ou quand les citoyens sont passifs ou manipulés, et ça arrive en ce moment, puisqu'il y a une montée de l'extrême droite partout, quand même, dans le monde, eh bien, ce sont des gens qui exploitent le malaise social, qui n'ont pas de solution, mais qui désignent des coupables, et ça marche, plus c'est gros, plus ça marche. Le Vantal, en son temps, dans Prophète du mensonge, avait expliqué tout ça. Eh bien, il faut donc que les individus soient très libres pour résister à tout ça qui peut entraîner la perte de la démocratie. Parce qu'on parle beaucoup du réchauffement climatique, et c'est effectivement fondamental, mais on aurait tort de dissocier cette question-là de l'effondrement démocratique. Et donc, et là je fais une transition à l'autre question sur les sciences, plutôt un pluriel, et le rapport avec le politique, c'est que la démocratie doit être transformée parce que, effectivement, il y a énormément de travaux sur cela maintenant depuis au moins les années 80-90. Elle doit être transformée parce que les problèmes liés au réchauffement climatique sont très complexes et pendant longtemps, ils n'étaient pas très visibles, ce qui fait que les citoyens n'avaient pas immédiatement le sentiment que leur santé et l'environnement étaient dégradés. Et donc, il y avait une distorsion entre le sentiment de leur intérêt, les personnes pouvant les représenter, et la réalité des choses. Et puis, il y a donc des médiations entre les sciences, la société et le pouvoir. Mais en même temps, on ne peut pas dire que le pouvoir sera seulement lié à des experts. On ne peut pas confondre la prise de décision qui tranche et tous les processus de délibération et où le politique peut être éclairé par les controverses scientifiques. Qui sont pas, il ne faut pas instrumentaliser les sciences pour faire que les scientifiques donneraient le feu vert à des actions. C'est plus complexe que ça. Mais il y a effectivement à transformer nos institutions et peut-être la culture politique pour enrichir les débats, savoir de quoi on parle, pour qu'il y ait une traduction des données scientifiques souvent très complexes sur le climat auprès des scientifiques et de la société, afin que les décisions soient prises de manière plus éclairée. Et c'est vrai que, encore une fois, depuis 40 ans qu'il y a des travaux là-dessus, sur précisément les transformations de la démocratie en raison des technologies et de l'écologie, eh bien, on voit que malheureusement, c'est souvent les médias, les réseaux sociaux qui deviennent presque les sources d'information et des citoyens et parfois des politiques. Donc du coup, c'est là encore une fois ce décalage entre une inventivité intellectuelle et des procédures très fines, délibératives, participatives et au niveau du rapport science-société-pouvoir, et puis une réalité qui est finalement très décevante. Et là, et je finirai par le fait que c'est pourquoi il faut vraiment réfléchir, nous qui sommes là, à ce qu'on pourrait faire d'utile et qui soit radical. Moi, j'aime pas trop le mot révolution, vous aviez raison, ça a été dit. Mais radical, ça veut dire prendre à la racine les choses profondes. Et comment arriver à ce que les créations qui existent, dans les sciences, dans la philosophie, les sciences sociales, parce qu'il y a beaucoup de créativité en ce moment, sur la démocratie, sur l'écologie, énormément, et bien même en littérature, où les artistes se saisissent de ces sujets. C'est beaucoup. Moi, je peux le dire parce que quand j'ai commencé à travailler sur ces sujets, les animaux, l'écologie, c'était pas trop à la mode il y a 15 ans, même il y a 15 ans. Mais eh bien, ça passe pas assez au niveau des politiques. Et ça, c'est ça qui... On n'a pas les bons ambassadeurs. Et là, sans doute, des gens qui travaillent sur le financement des partis politiques, le recrutement des personnes qui sont à la tête des grandes compagnies, mais aussi des postes clés. Il faudrait s'interroger parce que nous, souvent, nous nous sentons quand même impuissants quand nous faisons nos livres.
Merci. Professeur Harcombe.
Bien, alors, ces trois questions, I'm going to tell you, the three questions were fascinating, right? We had science, politics, with a sharp contrast between science and politics, and then money. So let me just say, the current attack on higher education and on universities as being too politicized is itself a political move. It is entirely politicized. You just go to Florida and see what Governor DeSantis is doing, destroying universities. That is a political move. It's totally, so it's not as if that's not political. And also the idea that we can't afford a crisis. I mean, we're in the worst crises we've ever been as a human species. So we are at a crisis. Not that it's not that we can avoid a crisis, we're in it. So obviously we have to think through it. Now, the only way to think through these crises are through the social sciences. Okay, so the natural sciences are going to give us estimates of the degree increases of global warming, et cetera. But the social sciences aren't going to give us ways out. These are social policies. This is social governance. This is society. This is us governing. And it's going to require social scientists. Now, surprisingly, most of the social scientists that are involved in this project are about as positivist social scientists as you can get. We're talking about Thomas Piketty, who is a positivist historian of the economic change. You yourself are relatively positivist. Joe Stiglitz is a positivist social science. So I mean, we're not in the humanistic social sciences. We're in the space that is closest to science. But what's clear and obvious, and as Jeff Mann said, is that at some point in the social sciences, you take a leap. There is a leap. The social sciences will require something different. And politics is going to be, of course, very important. But what's going to be most important at that place where positivist social science ends and some form of leap needs to be taken is the missing word in the conversation, which is ethics, right? And that's where the turn to ethics and to one's own ethics is most important here. And I agree that the turn to questions of ethics and subjectivity can sometimes lead in a demobilizing direction, because it's as if, well, wait a minute, in other words, to change the world, you got to change yourself, and you get caught up changing yourself, and then you get distracted from changing the world. But actually, no, changing the self it needs to be a prerequisite in order to understand how to take on these questions and how to act ethically in the face of these questions. So I think the most important is for us to be looking at ourselves and asking ourselves these questions as a form of a transformation that will be hopefully revolutionary, because where we're headed right now in this Star Wars war, right, is frightening, actually, in terms of global climate crisis.
Thank you very much. And Professor Ghosh, last words for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think my fellow co-panelists have already said so much that there's very little to add. I just want to agree, all knowledge is political. It's not true that, science is apolitical, social sciences are somehow different, and so on. All knowledge, what you decide to look at, the questions you ask, the methodology you choose, these are all, what do I mean by political? They are driven by power. And so the question, therefore, is what is the power that you are, which is the way you're siding, if you like, in power? And that's where the ethical question comes in as well, right? I mean, so there is knowledge of all kinds, including humanistic knowledge, which can be deeply motivated on the side of the already powerful. So it's really a question of choosing, in a sense, choosing your side and being aware that it is a choice, and being aware, recognizing that choice that others make as well. So I completely agree with what has been said, but recognizing that we have to see everything as representing an awareness of power and its imbalances, and then in terms of judging where you're going to be in those imbalances. Reform versus revolution, in a sense, is what the big other question was, in a way. And I think that also related to, where is the money coming from for doing that? If we are essentially thinking of taking taxes out of what is fundamentally a deeply extractive and exploitative system, then you're just perpetuating the system. I think this boils down to a question of how you think change comes about. Yeah. And let's face it, I grew up with a gang of people who would be horrified to hear me, you call me positivist, right? Because we were all these big revolutionaries, it was around the corner, death of capitalism, it's going to end tomorrow, etc. And, frankly, I've grown tired of waiting for the final capitalist crisis. So, and I'm too old also now to wait for it. I now think you have to chip away at whatever you can, in whichever direction. So yeah, taxes, yes, let's chip away at that. Global debt problems, global financial architecture, yes, let's try and chip away at that. Looking at how to fund health properly, let's chip away at that. Getting away from the privatization of basic public services, let's chip. In other words, attack everything you can in different ways and in as many possible directions, because these are huge problems. These are not things that are, you solve one and then you solve the problems of the world. These are all around us, and they're all interrelated, and they all reflect power imbalances. Yeah? So let's get at whatever we can, And here I just want to end, it follows on what you said, Jeff, actually, about, you called it solidarities across different groups. My colleague at UMass Amherst, Nancy Folbray, very wonderful feminist economist, she has this wonderful phrase, necessity is the mother of coalitions. And oh my God, is necessity obvious right now, yeah? So let's just, do coalitions as much as we can, as many as we can, in whichever ways we can.
I think it's a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you merci en français, je ne sais plus dans quelle langue je parle, je suis désolée. Merci beaucoup d'être restés. On a un petit peu dépassé le temps, mais bon, comme je savais que c'était la dernière séance, je me suis dit qu'on pouvait parce que la discussion était vraiment importante et intéressante. Et merci beaucoup pour toutes vos contributions. Thank you so much. I think we know where to go now. Thank you.
Merci à vous. Merci à vous.